Hi there, my name is Ischa Ropert. I'm a transformational life coach, and this is The Higher Life, where I take concepts that are considered esoteric, spiritual, psychological, or new age, and unpack how you can extract the wisdom of these to lead a more empowered life. And it's a really important time in history for every human being who has the capability and the time and the resources to really start turning inwards and shifting what personal power means to you or to me or to any individual that really wants to contribute to our world in a positive way. You know, the era of going out there and trying to fix, solve, and improve, that's fast coming to an end. And it's calling us inwards to really start to understand at a more intimate level this inner resourcefulness that every single human being has to cultivate a kind, empathetic, and compassionate way of being with themselves, with others, and with what we fear in this world. And when we're able to operate out of this level of empowerment, we'll see a natural peace and prosperity move through the whole human system, and therefore allowing for people who are not yet able to access the same abundance that I am or you are to start living in a more fruitful and prosperous way, and people who are in the middle class to feel more empowered in their personal lives. This is a real gift. And in today's episode, I want to talk about a very specific pathway that we are on when we choose to move out of enmeshment. That is where our sense of self and our personal power is directly related to how we were culturally conditioned to be in the world. That is, we seek outside of ourselves for our sense of identity. To empowerment, where we're really fueled from an inner natural authenticity. It's so simple, isn't it? Moving away from being told who you are to really owning your natural persona, especially as we are educated to see the outside world as our referencing point. That is, who I believe I am has been shaped by the cultural context that I was born into. So it takes a little bit of work and some effort to actually step out of that cultural conditioning and start to step into a more authentic space. One also needs to understand, what is my authentic self? How do I actually become more familiar with this part of me that nobody has reflected back to me throughout my lifetime? Now, working as a transformational life coach, I've been in the unique position to actually access a lot of tools and resources that really help people become more authentic. And through The Higher Life, what I'm doing is sharing the insights from almost 20 years now, walking people through the path of personal transformation. I believe personally that it is personal transformation that is the source of personal power. That is, when we transform out of this more superficial way of being in the world, own our true power, step into our authenticity, we start to access true personal power. So in today's episode, I want to talk about discernment in the way that we view specific instructions that we are given along this path of personal transformation. You know, sometimes it takes me a while to really get to what I want to say, but let's start here. Often when we're walking the path of personal transformation, or you're working in any type of environment where this transformative education is present, we are told that we need to let go. It's also a part of Buddhist philosophy. You know, this idea that you've just got to let go. But it does trigger this idea of giving up. So there is a difference between giving up and letting go. There's also a difference between surrender, which is another phrase that is used or concept frequently in spiritual growth circles. You know, this idea that you have to surrender into the flow of life or surrender to life. And that's not the same as abandoning yourself within your life. And I have found that exploring the discernment between these two concepts in each of these examples that I've given really helps you to understand how refined your power becomes when you actually start to live in a way where you can let go easily and act in a place of surrender. Because I know myself in my personal life, one of the biggest barriers that I've had to letting go is this idea that I'm somehow giving up. And what am I really letting go of? You know, in the beginning of my time working as a transformational life coach, and when I started to explore more personal spirituality, a lot of the messaging that came through was this idea that you have to give up your ego, you know, and this kind of demonizes the ego. It makes it seem like the problem. and that your authenticity then would be some sort of spiritual self that's really pious and empowered and above the ego reality. And of course, there's an element of truth to that. But today, in service of the work that I do here, which is really about becoming more empowered in your personal life, we're going to claim back the ego as a very powerful tool. The ego is in fact the vehicle or the way that your unique persona is able to express itself in the world. However, it's a very malleable, adaptable part of ourself. And therefore, when we're born into a family system or a cultural system, it is easily shaped and manipulated by the conditions that we are born into. And as a baby, obviously with no access to language, we're easily shaped by those forces that we're born into. And it takes a really long time for us to start to wake up to a possibility that the self that we have been told we are, or that we've been conditioned into, doesn't really resonate, and that there's another self that is living inside of us that feels more true. Now, often there's a lot of crossover. You know, in my own life, who I'm conditioned to be, my true self also flows through into that conditioning. However, it's taken a bit of work to realize that, you know, Ischa, who's born in Amsterdam, that was raised in Australia, that's a middle-class modern woman educated in a particular way, is really how I've been conditioned to see myself. That there's this other authentic persona that is really present in me, you know, one that's made up of virtues and archetypes and karmic storylines. So I've spent many years exploring who that self is. But the difference is really in the way the self identifies. You know, when you're born into a family, the ego seeks to know itself from taking on external stimuli, external messaging. That is, who I think I am is decided by an outside force. And this is going to play into a lot of that Buddhic wisdom, which is about, you know, that idea that you can't look outside yourself for your truth. When the ego is functioning in a really healthy and empowered way, instead of it being formed from an outside source, it actually becomes a conduit for this internal authenticity. So instead of yourself coming in on you, you're actually having a self that flows through and out of you. And it does that through the ego or the physical body or the persona. I mean, we could use different words for that, but I like to keep the ego specific. It really is the capacity or the aspect of ourself that can be conditioned because of its flexible and agile nature. But therefore, it's also perfect to let that authenticity flow through unencumbered by any kind of constrictions. You know, so it's a really beautiful thing when you can visualize this, that on the path of personal empowerment, what we're letting go of is that external referencing point. Therefore, freeing up our ego to really do its job and allow that authentic self, that authentic essence nature to flow out through who we are into our relationships and into the material plane. So when we think of letting go, we're letting go of the way that we reference who we are. However, in my own life, I've often seen letting go as giving up, you know, giving up on my desires, my needs, my aspirations. You know, when they're not working out, people just say, well, just let it go. You know, and that feels like, no, I don't want to give up on my potential. And in Western modern culture, you know, that is a very powerful external referencing point that we are often blind to. I have been educated to believe that I need to fulfill my potential by going out in the world and achieving and progressing and performing. Of course, when, you know, my goals or my aspirations or the things that I think I need to feel good in the world aren't fulfilled, I believe that somehow in letting go of that, I'd be giving up on my potential. But it brings me into that question of whether fulfilling my potential in this way is actually part of my authentic self, or it's something that I've been conditioned to believe is important. So you can see how important it is to really start digging deeper into this concept of letting go and giving up. You know, getting clear on, we don't give up or let go of the ego, we give up or let go of the way the ego seeks to express itself in the world, and how our self is effectively designed and defined and shaped. And it really is only usually possible to do this in the adult phase of our lives. That external self has been shaped from birth right through till 21, because we're often in educational systems that are very powerful in their conditioning, in the way that we are led to or guided to believe our worth should be utilized in the world, often through performance, achievement, accumulation, having a certain status, having a certain career or lifestyle. And I speak to this a lot in many of the episodes at The Higher Life. So this brings us into the second phase, this idea of surrender and abandonment. When you're surrendering, again, it kind of almost feels like you're giving up. But again, the surrender is bringing us back to, the way that we engage with our capacity to manifest, our will, the way that we use our energy and our focus. We surrender the idea that we can actually move out of the higher storyline or the higher agenda that our life is destined to flow along, and go off on a different trajectory that this conditioning that we have been subjected to tells us we should be doing. So putting it simply, when we're conditioned from 0 to 21, we're told to go on a pathway that is not really authentic. It's the culture, the economic cycle that is telling us this is where your value is. This is the kind of person you need to be, and this is the kind of lifestyle you should aspire to keep this cultural context alive. We're feeding the system. And that system has very little regard for our authentic self or our true self. So surrendering that part of ourselves is in fact giving up this falsehood, this fantasy, this mirage that if we succeed along that trajectory, we will be rewarded and we will feel good and at peace and prosper. So many of us have gone down that path and just proven it not to be true. So this is not an idea that I'm sharing with you. It's a proven lived experience by millions and millions of people who have followed that cultural pathway, that systemic pathway that has been indoctrinated into us and not experienced fulfillment. And that often is what wakes people up to the idea that there must be more to life than what you have been raised to believe is available to you. And that's when most people start, their journey of personal transformation. I know that was true for me. So then, this question of surrendering this pathway, that's terrifying, because you feel like you're going to miss out. You've already gone along that pathway quite far, and maybe if you just go a little bit further, try a little bit harder, that reward will come. So it's a big deal to surrender that part of yourself, to surrender that pathway and to claim back your authenticity. You almost feel like you're abandoning yourself, but it is not true. Abandonment is when you actually stop taking care of yourself, or don't know how to take care of yourself, or honor your true nature in your daily life. We often abandon ourselves in our relationships because we want to experience harmony, for example. So we don't really listen to our inner voice. We abandon ourselves daily by following a trajectory that is not our own and not taking the time to really reflect and contemplate, is this pathway serving my highest well-being, for example? I've had to do that so many times in my life, facing this challenge of being told by my culture as a modern Western woman I should be very successful in my career and also have a family. And sometimes we need to choose between those two trajectories if we really want to feel well in ourselves and be able to give ourselves enough time to take care of everything that we need to take care of in our own personal sphere before we go out and actually fulfill other roles, like being a mother or being in the career force. These are really important inquiries that we are being asked to explore when we no longer just follow these trajectories blindly. So that idea of abandoning yourself, it's when you fail to speak up for yourself when you know that you want to, or you let other people have their way when you don't really agree, or you force your ideas onto people because you're afraid of not having your needs met. It's much more to do with emotional enmeshment. It is not abandoning yourself to question whether the pathway of success or the model of success that you have been fed from birth right through to young adulthood is actually aligned with what you really want to be doing in your life. So through this path of personal transformation, you really become intimate with the difference between letting go of a self and a trajectory that is really not aligned with your resonant or true self. You're not giving up on your potential by doing that. You're just contemplating whether that version of living out your full potential is actually accurate and right for you. And this takes focus, attention, exploring it in the way that I've been able to do over the last 20 years. And that's why I bring this education to you in the way that I do, because not everyone has the time or the access to really consider these big inquiries. So I'm trying to nut it down for you. So maybe in your life today, it's worth exploring, do I think about how I can surrender aspects of myself that aren't really serving me? Do I feel like I'm abandoning myself when I question whether the way I'm using my energy is actually serving my true or authentic self? Powerful, powerful stuff. Now, I've done lots of other episodes on how to identify your true self, to understand the ego and the way it operates through you in a more skillful way, at Higher Life Academy. But if you want to understand more about the path of personal transformation and how it empowers your life, you can also check out my relatively new podcast called The Pearl Effect, where I lead people through that actual effect that happens in your personal life when you move through this type of transformation. So I really hope this has offered some insight for you to feel more empowered in your life. And until next time, I hope you take care and love life.